All right, next up, we've got Rob Stauffer. Hey, Rob.
Hey, Chris.
So give us a little background on yourself so people know who is Rob Stauffer.
Sure. So before joining SideFX in 2013, I worked in production for about 20 years. I started at Digital Domain in the 90s, late 90s, and went through Weta Digital, Asylum FX, Sony Imageworks, and ended up at Rhythm and Hues for a while, and then left there in 2013 to join SideFX.
Right on. So what are you going to be talking about today?
Today, I'm going to go over some of those awesome features that everybody saw in the launch video for Solaris and what's new in 18.5 as far as Solaris is concerned.
Excellent. Well, let's get started.
Cool. All right, so I have a real basic scene here. I just have one sublayer node that's bringing in everything. I have a couple of lights, just one environment light, dome light, and one sunlight. And as you can see from the render here, it's pretty dark, kind of flatly lit, and so we're gonna work on that a little bit too. And I have two cameras, so I'm gonna pop back over into GL. So you see here, we got a pretty nice representation of everything here in our GL viewport. There's a few things that we can do. I have a pretty good machine here, so things are moving around pretty well. But if you wanted to turn things on and off, there's a lot of ways that you can do that. We've covered in the past how you can just go right into your scene graph tree here and start turning things off that way. So here I can turn off all that stuff. I can go up and turn off the effects. Oh, that's the wrong one. And get us just that terrain and the market. Now you'll see here this middle icon is red. These are all my viewport overrides. I can say clear all viewport overrides. Another nice thing that I can do here is let's go back in and turn off all of those assets again. So let's turn off all the foliage. And I want to turn off all of the effects. And now I want to go over here and I want to say save viewport overrides. And I can call this market and terrain only. And so now I have that. You'll see this is now in this menu that I can say, oh, market and terrain only. And it brings back those viewport overrides. And of course, as usual, I can go in and say clear all viewport overrides to bring that stuff back. A nice new feature with Houdini 18.5 is we've added a new node called Loft Payload Info. And what that does, if you remember in the past, we have some control over here to turn off or unload all of the payloads in the viewport. So you see when I do that, everything goes away because in this case, everything is payloadable. So, I would have to go in, I could go in and say, all right, let's go to shop back and load those payloads. Let's go in the shop front, load those payloads and start going through and turning things back on. But the downside is I don't see any representation of where everything else is in my scene. So with this Loft Payload Info node, if I just put that into my network there, you'll see that it generates a bounding box for all of those payloads. So just a nice way to visualize what is not loaded into your scene with a bounding box. So it's something that was added with 18.5. Okay, so let me load back all of those payloads. And, there we go. Took a minute. Another thing to point out is, in the viewport here, I have everything turned on. I can go into optimize here. I have my scene polygon limit set pretty high. So I'm going to turn this back down to something like 10 million, maybe 20 million. And that is going to, now, once I reach a certain polygon count, it's going to start turning things into bounding boxes like you see here. So for what we're about to do, I want to keep things pretty quick for the purpose of this demo. So I am going to go to my market and terrain only viewport override. So that's all I am seeing. And I'm going to start setting this up for sort of a multi-shot thing. So both of these cameras have some animation on them and it is sequential. So they don't each start at 1. This goes from 1 to 72 and this one goes from 72 to 240 or 248. Let's move that to 248. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to drop down a switch node. at the bottom and plug in both of my cameras. And after that, I'm going to put down an edit context options node. So we've introduced context options with Solaris, and it's a nice way to, you probably have seen the context options editor as well, where I can go in here and add, string menus, integer menus, give it a value, as well as a little bit of a label. So it's a nice interface for selecting things. We can do the same thing on the edit context options node. And we have a tab here that's called time-based options. And what that will do is allow us to set a frame range for that particular value. So it'll be driven by where we are in the play bar. So that way, in this case, we have sequential camera animation so that we can scrub through, and the goal is to drive the switch by this context option. So I'm going to set the first one from 1 to 72, and I'm going to give it an option name called shot, and shot value, or the value, is going to be shot 01. Let me add another one, delete what's there. And we're going to say from 72 to 248, and that is shot as well, and it's going to be shot 02. Now this shot, this option name is the variable that I want to plug into my switch. So if I go up here and I say backticks shot, it should work, and it doesn't. I get an error, and that error says unable to evaluate. Well, if we go back to our edit context options node here, you'll see that it's set to option type string. That's because that's what the value is, and this is looking for a number. It's a typical switch lop. So I'm going to switch this over to by name, and I'm going to plug that back in here like this. And I still am having a problem. And the reason for that is you'll see that the input name is using the input name default, which is whatever is being fed into that switch lop. And there's a couple of ways to remedy that. The first way is, or I think is the best way to do it, is to actually put down a null. And let's call this shot 01. And so now it's fine. So now that is the switch lop is setting that. You'll see it now says shot 01. That's what it's using as the name. So when it finds that value, it sets it to that name in the switch. So now I'm looking at shot 1 because that's where I am. So you'll see here in our network view that is the active connection. Another way that we could do it is actually go in here and say, well, I can rename it right here. And so now let's see if that works. So if I go past frame 4 to 72, you'll see that it's now looking at this side. So I don't recommend doing it that way. I think that for cleanliness and sort of organizational purposes, the null is the way to go. So let's all drag that over. So now I have a shot 02, and I can actually go back inside here and just delete what I put in there. And so it's sort of back to normal. So now that I've done that, I want to, the problem now is that this is great. I'm switching between the shots. It's switching between which sort of tree or which branch I'm looking at in my node lop network, but nothing's changing in the viewport. In fact, if I look at a camera, the moment I go to the next branch, it breaks because that camera is no longer there. So what I want to do to fix that is I'm going to drop down a render settings node and put that before the null. Now it's important to see here that so the primitive path is set to render and then $OS, which is calling on the name of that node. So I want to change where it says $OS to render settings. And I want to go down here where it says camera. If I control click on the arrow, it brings up my little select primitives menu, and I can select shot cam 1. And what this is doing is it is storing a primitive called render settings. In fact, you can see it in the scene graph tree here. And that's where Hydra, or when you render, that's what it looks for any sort of render settings, as well as the camera resolution, any AOVs, anything like that that pertains to your render. So what I want to do is I want to have one of these for each of the shots. So what I'm going to do in my camera field here is put a backtick, op digits, and then So what this little expression is doing is actually, if I middle click on camera, you see it's resolving, or it's evaluating the digit that is on the node that the expression lives on. So when I alt and drag this, it actually now says shot cam 2 because this is render settings 2. So it's a quick little cheat. If you have to make a bunch of nodes and it can be driven by the digit of the node, then it's an easy little thing to do. Nice little thing to do. Okay, so now that I have a render settings camera, so that means there's camera information stored on the render settings. If I click on render settings in my scene graph tree, you'll see in my scene graph details, there's camera shot cam 2. So that means that the current state of the scene graph tree there has a render settings primitive that has shot camera information. Now, I'm displaying from this edit context options down here, and I can go up here, and now there's an option in your viewport to say render settings camera instead of explicitly setting the camera. So what's nice about that is all it does is look at that primitive and set the viewport to whatever the camera is set to on those render settings. So as I drag through, I can switch between cameras. Okay, so now that I have that sort of set up, there's a few other things that I want to do. So I want to start messing with the lights. So I have these sequence lights here, and what I want to do first is I'm going to drop down a collection node. And what the collection node is going to do, what I'm going to use this for, is to put these two sequence lights into a collection that we will call sequence lights. And let's call this sequence lights. And I want it to, there's only those two lights in the scene, so I can just say all light primitives are going into this collection. And if I open up under my scene graph tree here, you see this little window closed. You'll see collections, you'll see sequence lights. In fact, if I click on the arrow here to select anything in there, you see it's selecting those sequence lights. So, so I know that that worked. So now I have a collection in my scene graph that is called sequence lights that contains those two lights. So we have a nice little workflow here for switching between shots, but I want to work as much as I can in the viewport. And so one of the things is if anybody has worked in the viewport before and you want to drop down a node, so you're in your viewport here, and you hit tab and you drop down a light and hit enter, it puts it at the end of the network. So it's basically looking for whatever I have selected, and it says, well, that's where the next node is going to go. And that's what it did here. It dropped down a light. If I was over here and I had this null selected and I did the same thing and I dropped down a light, it's going to put it right after that. Well, I don't always want to do that, and I don't want to have to move around each time that I want to work on that. I want to, when I'm working in the viewport, I might want to add lights or certain things in particular spots in my LOP network. So what I can do is we have these things called insertion points now. So I'm going to put one at the bottom here of my sequence lighting. And I can give this any name I want. I'm going to call this sequence lighting. And you see now in my viewport, I have a new menu that popped up that's called for the insertion points. And it's right now it's sequence lighting. And so what that does is when I select one of these, it will say that is where any node that you add in the viewport is going to go. So even if I'm displayed from down here, so let's say I have that and that was the last thing I did. I have edit context options. But I have sequence lighting selected as my insertion point, and I hit tab light, it drops it above that. So it makes it a little bit easier to be hopping around your network view while you're working. So I want to add two more of these. So let's tab insertion point, put one here. And this one I'm going to call shot lighting. And I'm actually going to drag and copy this one as well. And I'm going to leave them with the same name. They both can be shot lighting. So now instead of, you might think, well, why is that not shot 01 lighting and shot 02 lighting and shot 03 lighting and so on? Well, because I don't want to do that. I don't want to have all these different menus of like shot lighting, especially because I'm working on a multi-shot situation and I want it to just choose whatever the current shot is that I'm looking at. So we've already set up our context options to switch based on where we are in the timeline. So what I can do here is, instead of seeing all of my insertion points, I can just go, show me the ones that are in the current cook path. So what that means now, so my current cook path is on the left here. So if I go shot lighting and then hit tab, light, there it is. It goes right above that insertion point. If I change to, if I scrub along and I go to my next shot and I do the same thing, then it goes above that one. So now it's makes it a little bit easier to know that, or be confident that whatever you're looking at in the viewport, that is where anything you add in the viewport is going to go based on your insertion point as well as your context options. The other thing too, we have all these radial menus over here, and you know, by default, the default radial menu is main, and that means that when you hit C, that's the one that pops up. You see we have model, crowds, all these different options for you, and you can change that. You can go down to utility and you see that we have a radial menu for insertion points. So now those insertion points dynamically show up here. So if you added a bunch more for other things, they would show up here. So you could just say shot lighting and then hit tab light. And then again, I could say sequence lighting and hit tab light. And you see it's putting them all in the appropriate location. So again, these are just little sort of interactive tools that we've added to try and help you navigate your network and try to create a more seamless workflow between the viewport and the network, so that you don't add a bunch of things in your viewport and you look at your network and you're like, oh, that's not where I wanted it, or it's a mess now. So hopefully that will help quite a bit. The other thing that we can do too is, let me add a light mixer on shot 1 over here. So let me just put it right here. Make sure that I'm looking at shot 1 in the viewport. So you see, I already see my collection of my sequence lights. And of course I can drag over that whole folder and expand it, and I have all of those lights in there. Now I want to add another light. So I can do that also from my light mixer panel. So if I just go up here and I say, let's insert a point light, I get a parameter window that pops up, and I'm going to change it into a spotlight. Let's just give it some softness. And I want to drag that over to the mixer as well. So now I can start just kind of changing the values of that spotlight. Well, I'm not seeing anything. So let me solo the light for now. Actually, turn that off. I don't want to solo it yet. I want to make sure it's selected over here, or that I've selected that light. And now I'm going to, in the viewport, what I want to do is I want to interactively place this light in the viewport using some of our handy lighting tools. So if I hit H, it shows me all of the different controls I have to the different modes that you have when you're placing lights. So you'll see that Shift S is specular, Shift D is diffuse, and Shift F is shadow. So if I hit Shift F, it also changes up here. So I easily could click on these little buttons up here too, but I want to stick with shadow. And now what I want to do is, if I click on this table, that's the pivot point for where the shadow is going to hit the ground. So I click there as the pivot point for that point light, or that spotlight. And then if I shift click and place my target, that's going to place that right there. Now it's super close. It's not doing what I want. So I want to move it away. So if I control drag, it's going to move that light away for me. So I'm getting a better spotlight there. Now you'll notice over here that the intensity has gone up, way up. And that's because as I move the light away, it wants to make sure that the table, everything around it is getting the same sort of intensity, the same light value every time. So if it moves away, that means I have to increase that intensity. Now I could lock it if I wanted to. Let me bring it a lot closer and then keep brightness. So that way, as I move away, you'll see that it's losing some of that intensity because there's some fall off there. So it's now, and then I can turn some of this back up here. There we go. And then move it away. All right. So now it's sort of hopefully not as flat as it was before. And you'll also notice in here too that I have now, there's a subnet. So as I create lights, instead of having, let's say you started creating a bunch of lights. You made it 5, 6, 7 lights, and you would have all these individual light nodes stacked up, and your node graph or your network view it would be a mess. So what we're doing now is, as you create new lights from the light mixer, we create a subnetwork, and they all get dropped in there. So in fact, if I was just to create another point light here, I can go over here and say, insert point light. We'll call this, I don't know, point light B. And now you'll see it just puts it in here. So it keeps things a little bit cleaner. You also notice with a subnetwork here, we don't need the display flag like we did before. Okay, so I think that's sort of the gist of it. There's lots of other great new controls on the light mixer. I know Scott talked about it a bit in the launch video. Again, the spreadsheet view is still here. We can go in here and start messing with, actually, let's take this light, drag it over, and I don't want to use this at all. And then this point light, let's give it a little bit of color, something like that. And then maybe the environment light gets a little bit of blue, something like that. And okay, so it's shaping up a little bit. And again, I can scrub through to make sure I'm set to render settings camera. Okay, so now that I have some lighting set up, let's go over here and just for fun, let's make sure that I am in shot 2, and let's go to shot lighting and add a light here. And we can make this also a spotlight. And then maybe this one will be Shift F, click there and there. And let's move that up, and that'll be a little bit more top down. I can add a light mixer. Let's put that right after that. And let's just drag light 1 over here and give it a little bit of a blue context. And also, actually, let's bring these down. So, these are in a group, they're in a collection, and I can just bring the whole thing down like that. And then in the meantime, bring all of this up like that. And again, let's go back to make sure that we're looking. So now we're getting 2 different things. Okay, so this is really a really basic setup for doing some multi-shot workflow. So now that I have a couple of things set up, I have a couple of light setups here. What I want to do is maybe do some test renders. So we've introduced this new render gallery. So there's a little hard to see. You can pop it open here. So if I just click on that, this pops open, and I am going to look through my camera and hop on over to Karma, and let's get a render. All right, so there's a quick little render of shot 1. So now I want to do some testing on this. So let me just add, I'm just going to take a snapshot of that. So now I have one image here. Let me make sure this is set to the right resolution. There we go. Much better. Let's grab that. All right. So I have one image that I like. I'm like, okay, that's not so bad. Let me go back into my light mixer here, and let me mess with the sun a little. Doesn't look like we're seeing that much. I can go back. Well, actually, let me just use my point light. So you see here that the f-stop value is kind of at the top. So I can go up here and change that top value so that I have more room to mess with it. So I can start to bring that up and maybe change this a little bit. Maybe let's add some green. Don't judge me on this. This is just to prove a point. Okay, so now I have another variation of the lighting, and I can hit plus and add that to the render gallery. And I can keep going and going. I can star the ones that I like by clicking on the stars. The other nice thing that I can do is I can open up my render gallery. You may not have it split like this in your desktop. This is something I added. Let me close it down here. And I want to set this to A and this to B. And so now you see you can turn on, if you right click in your render gallery view and have diff selected, now I can slide between the two and see the differences in the lighting. So let's say, okay, I actually still like that first one that I did a little bit better. So I can click on that and say right click, revert network to this snapshot. So keep an eye on the light mixer. And so, oh, it went away. So all the values went back to those original values that I had used for that. So what that's doing is it's storing a snapshot of what all the values were for your lights at that time and goes back to that. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is we have added CryptoMatte support with Houdini 18.5 and Karma. So let's go over how to set that up quickly. So first thing I want to do is drop down an attribute wrangle, and I'm doing this because, you know, I want to use the prim name for this, and I can't set a constant array with a variable in it. So I couldn't set, this is a constant array that I'm going to use to do this, and I can't just say @prim name. So what I'm going to do is create this string array called temp, and we will set it to, we will push temp, and we'll do, let's put @prim name, and then prim vars, we'll call it crypto, and we'll say that's equal to temp. Okay, and we want to make sure up here that right now it's looking at render settings, because that's the last thing that was fed into that, which is not, we need to set this to something in the scene. So let's say /scene, let's do shop. We can actually do shop star and then star. So that way it's going to take, if we had just stopped at shop star, then it would, or shop back, then it would just take shop back and shop front and group everything in that as one value. But I want to take everything, all the descendants of that, the immediate descendants of each one of those. So that is what this is doing here. So now if I drop down a Karma node like this, and let's turn down these pixel samples so it goes fast. Let's go to image output, and on AOVs I have beauty turned on. Let's turn on normals, and let's turn on, just for fun, just so you can see that. And then render, extra render vars. And so here we'll call this CryptoMatte. This is the name, how it's going to show up in your file. And it is a 3 float color. So these are both set to 3 float color. And the source name, I believe it was crypto, we called it. And we want to set the source type to primvar and check CryptoMatte. So now if I hop back over to Karma here, all right, there is my render. And then if I go here, there's my CryptoMatte. Okay, so those are some of the highlights, just a deeper look at some of what we saw in the launch video. There's lots of other great stuff on there. If you go to the What's New section of 18.5 on our website, you can see some of the other great stuff in Solaris, as well as the rest of Houdini. So I hope you enjoyed, and more to come. Thanks for watching.